Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today we are going to be talking about pre-emergence herbicides with Jonno Shields, who is an agronomist from Bayer Crop Science. Welcome, Jonno.
Good morning and thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So let's talk about it's a good time of the year to be talking about what growers should be doing with pre-emergence herbicides.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that time of the year again. It's come around, the autumn's upon us, and obviously with our cereal crops, our pre-emergent herbicides are a really key component for weed control, and especially, I suppose, in light of recent developments with herbicide resistance, particularly to those post-emergent options that we've traditionally relied upon, especially for grass weed control.
What are the pre-emergence herbicide options for growers?
Yeah, look, there's a number of different options depending on crop type and weed species. I guess we'll sort of talk about the sort of products in the Bayer portfolio, I suppose, that I'm sort of familiar with, but there's certainly others, depending on situation. Typically, I guess, key sort of considerations are what we're trying to control. So grass weeds, obviously, things like ryegrass, particularly resistant ryegrass, really important to make sure we're using a product that's suitable for those grass weeds. Pyroxasulfur, the active ingredient in a product called Sakura, is a key active for grass weed control in wheat. Flufenicet in Firebird is another sort of key active ingredient for the likes of Voltia hairgrass and Poa. But it's important just to understand that, they're not all going to do the same job, and that we've got different strengths and weaknesses.
So challenges associated with pre-emergence herbicides with respect to environmental conditions. I mean, it's been quite dry in some regions. So, what's the best way making sure there's enough moisture around?
That's the key, driver to the success of pre-emergent herbicides. Obviously, they're applied to the soil as opposed to directly to the weeds. And so moisture is a really key component to ensuring that, the product's soluble and getting to where it needs to be. And if we talk about grass weeds, a lot of our pre-emergence herbicides are root sort of active. So they need to be in the root zone of weeds as they're germinating to be most effective. So ideally, we talk about having sort of a reasonable sort of amount of rainfall within sort of a week to 10 days after application to give us those best results. When we say good rainfall, obviously depends on conditions, soil types. Could be sort of 10 mils at the very minimum, 15 mils up to sort of 20, 25 would be the ideal. Obviously, it's the big factor that we can't control in a lot of situations. So I think probably a key thing for this season going into a dry autumn is that if you've got the ability to irrigate some of those pre-emergence and there's no rate on the horizon, then certainly something to think about. Just bearing in mind that dry conditions can often see a reduction in control, particularly where you've had good soil moisture or rainfall prior to application that might sort of trigger the germination of those weeds.
So, the big elephant in the room, I suppose, is the group 15 and the fact that we're now starting to pick up resistance, in Australia. And so the chances are that we're going to be in a similar, situation pattern of resistance building up over time. So tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Australia to the group 15s.
Yeah, so, like they are here, obviously the group 15s are relied heavily on, particularly for grass weed control in cereal crops. And much like we've here, obviously Australia's experienced significant resistance to a lot of their traditional post-emergent herbicides, their group 1s and 2s. And so there's been a certain reliance on this particular group of chemistry for grass weed control. Certainly, there's been a number of instances from weeds sent in from growers from a number of parts of Australia that have detected loss of sensitivity to group 15s or a reduction in sensitivity to group 15s. And also in the random survey work that they complete, where we're seeing very low levels of group 15 resistance picked up. And I think looking at the figures, they're sort of talking about 1% and 2% of the population. But it is a good sort of early warning that, nothing's invincible and nothing's bulletproof. And we need to make sure that we can do what we can to sort of try to manage them and ensure the longevity of these herbicides. I think what we sort of see is unfortunately, is a bit of a domino effect where we've got, resistance to certain groups develop, puts more pressure on subsequent groups. And then, we see that there's a potential route to sort of fast track that. So I guess probably the key sort of thing for New Zealand is that, while we have got some group 1 and group 2 resistance, we don't have it to the same level that they do in Australia. So really it's about, how do we steward all our herbicides and continue to keep them working for as long as possible to ensure, the longevity of everything really. Not continuing, particularly the group 1s and 2s, to use them as a sole means of weed control, because they're still really valuable tools to using in programs with our, pre-emergent group 15 type herbicides.
Yeah. So I guess what would be, the best strategy for growers then with their pre-emergence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we've got to really look holistically. So look at the bigger picture in terms of our rotations. We don't want to be putting them in under high pressure to begin with. So we obviously, ideally, say, for instance, if we're chasing grass weeds with a pre-emergent in wheat, coming off a break crop where we've been able to reduce, the weed burdens to start with, making sure our seed bed preparation means we've got, clod-free and relatively sort of trash-free conditions, which can be barriers for pre-emergence, and also our cultivation techniques. So minimising the depth and disturbance of weed seeds deeper into the soil profile where they're less able to take effect. So doing all those things right, using our pre-emergence up front, often using them in combinations, and we've seen some advantages with products like triolate used in conjunction with Sakura for grass weed control, particularly in dry conditions, and then following through. So potentially checking your paddocks, looking for potential survivors or weeds that have got through under dry conditions, taking appropriate action with any sort of post-emergent herbicides. And then beyond that, coming the end of the season, we might have survivors. And what we ultimately want to do is prevent them setting seed. So if we think about herbicide resistance management, it's about a numbers game. Preventing weeds from setting seed is the ultimate goal. So that might involve roguing, might involve cutting and baling sort of weedy areas like headlands and fence lines, just to ensure that those seeds those survivors don't pass on a problem to subsequent generations. And then I guess building on top of that, what we're doing in our rotation beyond that, and thinking about managing our weed seed bank sort of long term. It's not really a 1 year solution to sort of get on top of a problem weed paddock. It's about how do we continuously maintain lower weed levels, and by maintaining low weed levels, weed seed levels, reducing the chance of resistance developing just through sheer numbers.
Yeah, and making sure that you're using those herbicides at full rate and not sort of, because there was that trend, in a few years back about just, using half rates and things like that. But we can't afford for any sort of lack of 100% control, because then you've got all of those, weeds coming through. So do you think that message is getting across to growers? Do you think their awareness of herbicide resistance is now sort of up there? Because I know there was always that challenge, in New Zealand when we didn't have a lot of herbicide resistance, that people didn't want to admit that they did have it. And so, I think we were really concerned that, by the time we actually got everyone to admit that it was there, it might have gone, too far down the track for us to be able to manage. How do you feel that we are in New Zealand with respect to an industry being aware of the problem and understanding what the problem is and how to manage it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've come a long way in the last few years in terms of, certainly an industry as a whole. And it's been, through a lot of the survey and testing work that FAR and AgResearch have obviously led. And I think certainly, growers, the likes of ourselves, ag chem companies and those other sort of advisors have all sort of really started to work together in terms of approaches to managing this issue. It's a potential to be a big issue, particularly if you consider arable small seed crops and the value of those crops to growers. Ryegrass is a perfect example. So I think we've come a long way to accepting that it's a problem, and now we're really looking at how we sort of manage the issue and get on to do as well as we can, really. Because it's essentially a fact that within any population of weeds, we've got potentially resistant biotypes that are naturally occurring. There's no doubt about that. And by successive selection pressure, we're eventually going to get to a point of resistance where herbicides are no longer effective. So, understanding that we've got a problem and taking mitigative steps sooner rather than later is really key.
Compared to, for example, Australia, where would New Zealand grain growers sit with respect to resistance levels?
Yeah, look, I certainly, I guess as an example in Australia, our Group 2 herbicides for grass weed control, our ALS or SU type herbicides, are more or less completely considered ineffective for ryegrass control, as an example. There's certainly a key one here where we're seeing resistance developing, but they're still working at much higher levels. So I think we're in a better position in that respect. Same goes for our Group 1 herbicides as well. So really, once again, key to continue to ensure that they do work, because they're a very valuable part of a program. And then the other one, obviously, the other, I guess, two key ones we talk about today is Group 15s. Obviously, we want to, they're obviously an important part of this program, and we want to continue them to work. We've actually did a little bit of testing ourselves last year, just looking at our Group 15s, just to try to look to see if there's any early signs of sensitivity shifts. And we targeted, known troublesome populations where we knew we had resistance to our post-emergent herbicides. And we have actually seen some early indications of sensitivity shifts for Group 15. So we're not immune from it here. Fortunately, with our Group 15s, we tend to see a non-target site, or I guess metabolic type resistance, whereby we still maintain a level of efficacy rather than a sudden target site type ineffective product. So, once again, really important reason why we should be always using our full label rates and aiming for very high levels of control to prevent those reduced sensitivity populations from creating a problem. And I guess the other key one is glyphosate. Glyphosate resistance has now become quite common across the ditch. But unfortunately, our arable systems, we've still got glyphosate, working for us. But it's really important that we apply those same principles to glyphosate as well. Keeping our rates up, not just relying on it as a sole means of weed control, especially along things like fence lines, where it probably doesn't get a lot of thought and gets a lot of repeated use.
Yeah. So do you think sort of the ag chem companies are now, sort of really promoting, sort of integrated weed management practices, and as you say, working together with other with other companies and trying to get that message out around don't overuse any one group of of herbicide. Make sure that you're aware of resistance as a key risk, and try and incorporate cultural or physical weed management practices into your system. Is that the kind of messaging that's coming out from the ag chem companies now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think across the industry, the broader industry as a whole, especially our sort of advisory type people as well that are advising farmers. It's really key, I guess, from an ag chem company's perspective. I mean, discovering new herbicide modes of action is not easy. Certainly in the grass herbicide space, I think it could be sort of 30 odd years since we've had a new mode of action. So, the resistance is developing faster than we're getting new herbicides. So we need to continue to ensure that what we've got is continuing to work for as long as possible. So, yeah, I think that's a key component. I think having a better understanding of herbicide mode of action groups has been something we've come a long way in the last few years as an industry, and certainly something we tried to focus on with our education is including not just product or active ingredient, but also where they fit in terms of groups and encouraging diverse use of groups. And then, like you say, also those cultural practices are really important. We can't spray our way out of herbicide resistance. There's no silver bullet. And if we think again about, managing numbers, a herbicide, for instance, irrespective of resistance, might give us 90% control of grass weeds or weeds for in general. But you've always got potential for survivors to come through. Now, if we're employing other cultural practices, like good crop rotations, increasing crop competition, that potential, those couple of little percent on top of the herbicide, that all those little other steps make are huge, in terms of the bigger picture. So I think really, I think we need to think about how we need to take a bigger picture approach rather than just a single crop, single year focus.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the messaging that, that we're trying to get across to growers as well, is that, sort of, if we want to keep those ag chems working really well and delivering, the high level of control, we have to embrace the other types of control measures in order to bring them in order to protect the future of the ag chem. And that does makes it a little bit more arduous on the growers' point of view. They've got to think through the holistic picture. They've got to start thinking about biological control and cultural control. It can be quite a challenging story to get out there, value proposition. But if we don't do it, we're going to end up like some of the other countries where they've got very few ag chems available to use.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, we're a relatively small country to start with, so we probably don't have the diversity that may be available in other parts of the world. So we've got to use what we've got really well. Like you said, we're not quite in the position of places like Australia, so we need to learn from that. And yeah, certainly, consider, I guess, longer term benefits outweighing short-term gains. And I guess looking at it as yes, we might take an economic hit, for instance, cutting some of our crop or baling some of our crop that's got weed in it this year. But in the longer term, by stopping those weeds becoming a bigger problem, we're going to see those benefits for years to come. And as I said, and I touched on earlier, obviously small seed production and ryegrass, for instance, and other grass seed is a key component to our arable systems. And we, I guess, want to be able to continue to be able to grow those crops, free from resistant potential contaminants. So, if we consider those sort of values on top of just the usual traditional, I guess, approach to weeds and herbicide management about removing competition, which is going to affect my yield, which is obviously solely just a 1 year sort of economic type focus.
just a little plug for FAR here. Quite often, we will get some growers saying, oh gosh, we don't get any value from FAR anymore, sort of, I don't know what my levy is being used for. And I just say to them, we've kept blackgrass out of New Zealand for the last decade. That in itself is worth your levy. And I don't think people realise, sort of like if we can keep some of these weeds out, then, imagine if we had blackgrass in New Zealand and the impact that would have, particularly given the fact that it is also resistant to a lot of the herbicides. So yeah, you have to look at that big picture, and you have to look at it long term to actually start looking at how we can protect what we've got. Blackgrass would be the number one thing that we would not want to get into New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as we know from previous incursions, and obviously the response has been really good at being able to stamp them out. But we know that, if blackgrass does turn up, that it's going to already be resistant to a range of herbicides. So it's not as if we don't need these things coming in on top of our locally sort of, bred resistant ryegrasses, for example. I mean, we certainly know blackgrass is a whole other beast in terms of its adaptability and its ability to beat a whole lot of different control methods, be it, chemical or cultural type approaches.
So just last little word of wisdom, piece of sort of information for the growers around the pre-emergence space.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's really important we look at it, in the context of a bigger picture. Our pre-emergents are highly effective, but they're not a silver bullet, they're not a single solution. So we really support people, planning where they're going to use them, not putting them under excessive pressure, making sure their preparation's right, their seedbed type preparation, using them in programs with other herbicides, including other modes of action. And don't forget the role of, moisture that plays in terms of efficacy. Just as an example, and we've done a number of trials for a number of years, grass weed control, we can see under dry conditions post application, we don't get that rain within sort of a week or so. We can see control down to sort of 75% level. Good moisture after application can push control, well up into the 90s. The other, key thing just to remember too, that I can't speak for all pre-emergent or group 15 herbicides because they've all got different sort of chemical characteristics, but a product like Sakura and Firebird are obviously moisture is very important. However, they are UV stable and non-volatile, so they will actually remain there until we do get rainfall, and then they'll kick in and provide us that residual control. So something we do get asked a lot of questions. It's going to be dry. Should I put on a pre-emergent herbicide? Really that's an individual case-by-case situation, but it's important to remember that they will start to work when we've got moisture. And obviously in a lot of situations where resistance is an issue, we may not have those other options to come into post-emergence later on. So I think that's just something important to consider too.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jonno. And thank you very much, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.